Thank you.
I'm just going to offer two general commentaries with a sort of invitation to extend things that you may have already touched on to start with, and if you like them, you can pick up on them, and if not, I will have other things to say. One thing I think is really powerful about hearing these three presentations together is that they offer some new ways that we might start to think about invasiveness as something that crosses species lines, right, and creates outcomes and events that impact not just humans or non-human life in separate ways, but in some fashion are tied together in a political ecology that is political and ecological sort of all the way through. And they pointed very clearly to me to invasiveness as in relation to a series of oppositions. And I think some of those oppositions are politically difficult or troubling, right? So in the opposition of invasiveness to nativeness or to purity. And this is, I think, frequently invoked when invasiveness is discussed in an ecological setting, right? And so in different ways, all three of you touched on that trouble. And that is, in a debt, in a way, to ecology's own language of invasiveness and nativeness, right? And in a sense that we sort of picked up on and have returned. But I think you all also raised other oppositions or other antonyms of invasion or invade. And I think those open actually a wider range of possibilities than that sort of fixation on invasive and native would actually allow. So I wanted to sort of ask you if you wanted to either expand on your own sense of that or on the ideas of others. And that might invoke any one of a number of other meanings. One opposite of invade might well be to aid or to assist. A second one might be to help or to protect. And a third one that I'm not sure any of the three of you picked up might be to leave alone, right? So the opposite of to invade could well be to leave alone, rather than to enmesh and broil further. So that's just one, I think, quite sort of general question about if we're here to think about invasive others and invasiveness more broadly, in what way are we thinking about, in opposition to what sets of terms are we thinking about that, and what's at stake in trying to use one set rather than another? And then a second sort of general question I have for the panel has to do, well, it starts, I guess, from the description of the panel as having a focus on the common language of invasion, right, and the sort of discourses of invasion. And in many ways, you've all spoken about, right, the ways that humans are speaking about invasiveness as very central to your accounts in different ways. And what I find interesting about this is the way that that linguistic emphasis, on the one hand, allows us to see the common threads across these rhetorics of invasive species and invasive humans, right? But on the other hand, it also redivides them by putting a very strong emphasis on human language as the thing that's sort of doing the work here. And that kind of linguistic competence is frequently something that we say non-human species don't have, right? Human language is something that, well, we think most humans have, and even there, that's a questionable assumption politically, the way it's played out in terms of who can speak, right? Who is linguistically competent and in what ways. And so something I'm really interested in is how helpful do you find language as the sole sort of common thread to draw these different kinds of invasivenesses? Is that a word? The plural of invasiveness? To draw these different kinds of invasivenesses together. Or to what extent could we extend or more explicitly be attentive to other concepts and practices around invasion that might help us think about the ecology's side of this, right, very directly. And you've gestured to this already in different ways, but if you'd like to go further on that, that would be wonderful. I'll throw it to whoever wants to jump in.
All right. I'll look at that from my research point of view. I think now it's on. Okay. The concept of invasiveness, it is both, as I was saying, physical but linguistic, so metaphorical in a way. And I think this sort of sense, it's based on a general sort of division, separation between the here and there. In a way, we think that metaphors originate from very physical experiences. The issue is, of course, that already talking about the here and there becomes a linguistic move that separates realities. So I think that's the beginning of the complication. In terms of food, that is what I've focused on, think about the difference between the local and the global. For instance, it's a very important separation when we talk about food and food politics. But in reality, if we look at how things developed, there is no local without the global, and vice versa. I mean, we've been globalized since the start, and at the same time, now the local is able to acquire value because there is a global. So now the global is perceived as invasive, while in reality has been foundational to define the reality in which we live. I don't know, one example that I like to quote quite often in my country, in Italy, there is a political party that is really against not only immigration, but also people from the South. You know, Florence down, you're another species. We are Celts, you guys are descendants of the Latin. So they superimpose all sorts of weird structures on this. And at a certain point, they decided to use food to point out the attacks, the invasiveness of globalization. So they put out posters that said, yes to polenta, not to couscous, right? And they organized sort of performances, demonstrations where people were fed polenta, cooked in a specific way with specific ingredients, without realizing that polenta is not originally from there. You know, it's been in Italy only from the 16th century. I mean, if you want to get picky, couscous has been in Italy for much longer because of the Arabs and all that. But the way that discourse is created, the local, created by globalization, really makes you think about how sort of a linguistic, metaphorical operation then becomes operational when you start discussing very real political issues.
I liked your framing actually because in a way I think that the sort of binaries or the provocations that you presented about aid, assistance, protection, et cetera, that actually I think is sort of the other side of the invasive other, right? It's kind of like, and so I was thinking like, you know, what if the conference were called, you know, the invading selves or something like that, you know, because I think that we're sort of, it invites a binary thinking in a way. So that's why, you know, I'm sort of interested in, and it was really only because of the conference that I started thinking about this, so thanks for that. But, you know, thinking about hospitality and the ways in which host-guest relations kind of, you know, so I use that Michel Serres quote, not because I really understand what he writes about exactly, but because he complicates the particular relation between host and guest and says, you know, they're basically the same. So I think that, you know, for me thinking about, you know, I've been parallel to how I've been thinking through the paper I just presented, but my work in general has been questions about cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitics. So I think that, you know, and this came out very clearly, especially in the papers about the refugee crisis, and in Bridget's paper yesterday, you know, Europe and many other nations are facing the impossibility of true cosmopolitanism or sort of unconditional cosmopolitanism. So I think, you know, looking very closely and empirically at how these, you know, how the boundaries are drawn and how the relations are actually worked out, because, you know, like the discourse of we can't take them all, right? That's kind of the limit of liberal humanism and cosmopolitanism. So then what? Like then what do people do? So that's sort of how I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been interested for excuse me. I've been interested for a long time in this movement of language between biology and the social. I mean, in many ways. I mean, you see this. Yes, sorry. as I was saying, I've been interested for a long time in this movement in language, between biology and the social, in the ways that biologists, for instance, are almost, well, I'm trying to think. Okay, let me put it like this. For any of you who I don't know if there are people here who read a lot in biology, in biological texts, or in ecology, or even in conservation. But I'm sure you know that so many terms are just derived directly or taken directly from social terms. So not just things like invasion and aliens and these kinds of things which we're talking about today, but even forms which will just describe social behavior are drawn directly. So like in insects, for instance, that I've spent some time thinking about, for instance, if you want to think about bees, then the whole form of social structure of bees is drawn from models of sort of, I guess, a form of 19th century anthropology, actually, where you have tribes, you have castes, you have all these kinds of things, races, all these kinds of things, and then they're applied in a way, they travel in a way that both separates them from their social context, but also just directly takes that form and sort of reproduces a sort of understood, a sort of commonsensical form into this well, as an explanatory form, not just as a descriptive form for social behavior in the animals. And then at the same time, then at a certain point, it also then gets fed back. I mean, in 1960s and 1970s sociobiology, for instance, you see this happening over and over again, where the forms of social organization in social insects, in bees and in ants, for instance, are then used to make political comments on individualism and collectivism, for instance, in Cold War politics and Cold War, particularly in Cold War sort of like polemical writing during the Cold War. So there's this movement between biological terms, there's a linguistic movement, very much in sort of like categorical terms between biological thought and social thought, which in some ways has a kind of inevitability about it. And at this point is so deeply entrenched in forms of description in the biological sciences, particularly I think in the animal sciences, that it's very hard to see ways around it. And very little also, I mean, those sciences haven't gone through the kinds of self-destruction and partial reconstruction that the human sciences have gone through, in the sense of really this sort of like deep self-flagellation about our practices and ethics and what have you. To some extent they have. I mean, there's a whole field of bioethics, but it doesn't work at the level, it hasn't worked, so far as I'm aware anyway, at the level of the sort of like meta level of particularly thinking through the forms of description in science, in these sciences. So there's a whole set of there's a large domain that we can think about, in a long history that we can think about, of this sort of linguistic traffic and back and forth. So I suppose what I'm preoccupied, and that seems to come up in other people's talks as well, is the naturalization of this kind of language in common parlance, if you like. So that when we're using a term like invasion or alien, there's this constant slippage, and that we're not really sure if we're using this as a biological term, as a social term. It moves quite freely between them. And so I think one of the things that we might want to do in thinking through this is to try to specify a little more and draw attention to it and point to some of the consequences of using this kind of language. So.
I think I could agree with that framing, right, and that sort of critical move, in the sense of, right, looking at the discourse and its circulation politically. And at the same time, so when I co-taught a class with an urban ecologist here at the New School, and we had one session on invasive species, in which I presented the discourse argument about the way that native and invasive function, not just in politics, but even through conservation biology and other forms of science, and circulate, right? That there's sort of a circulatory work that discourse is doing. And he presented the argument from the side of conservation biology, which was to say that, okay, what if we change the labels on what we're doing? Let's not call them invasive species. Let's just call them something else, right? Harmful species. This is rhetoric, right? And yes, I agree with your critique, he said, but on the other hand, how do we move forward with the material study of invasive species in an ecological kind of setting? And so I came out of that class actually quite frustrated, and have been for years since, in that there are, sort of, this is Latour's, two houses mutually paralyzed, right? That the natural sciences and the social sciences, or interpretive worlds, both connect and yet have a very deep disconnect at the very same time. And I think part of what I was interested in with all of your talks is to think, does a continuing focus on discourse, right, and the discourse of invasiveness, actually hinder the possibility of those two kinds of knowledge meeting more fully in some way? And does that actually suggest that we, in some fashion, in social research, need to get to materialities or affect, or right? There are many different sorts of terms we could get to, but whether that would actually stop that kind of circulation over time, or at least help us understand it better. I wanted to also put a question to Alina a little bit, and maybe to others as well, that I was really interested to hear more about flyways and birds. I just wanted to relate a quick incident that happened on a recent research trip to the U.S.-Mexico border in Brownsville, Texas, as part of the Zim Institute here, with a number of people who are here. And we were down at the border wall at a site called the Hidalgo Pump House, which is an old agricultural pumping station for water. It's also a major world birding center, right? So, which I didn't know and still know very little about. But people come from all over the world, all over the country, to watch the bird migrations here. And while we were there was just a very troubling incident that's really stuck with me and haunted me since then, which was that there were also, as we walked up to the border wall in this birding center, and there are people with binoculars everywhere looking for birds, there were also two individuals who were hiding in the grass who we spotted. And the long story short, I guess, is that they had hopped the wall and they were trying to go north, and they were, I think, reported to the Border Patrol by a number of the birders who were there, right? And then very quickly the Border Patrol apparatus sort of swoops down, and they're taken into a van and handcuffed and sent off. And it's just two very stark lines for me, in the sense that of trying to understand the relationship between invasiveness in human context and non-human context. That for many of the birders in this spot, there were two very distinct logics, right? Two very distinct ways of thinking about it, and the invasion of others from human context was very different from their sort of thrill at watching the flyways, right? Migratory birds from many different places, and the kind of hospitality, right, that they took on them. So I'm wondering, I guess my question in that long anecdote is really just, how do we think about, if that's the starkest version of a binary, in what ways do you think we might be able to use that proximity to sort of rethink invasiveness or invasion? Is there a way to, should we try to bring those more under a common umbrella? And is it sort of a way of trying to make people see the interconnections in their own logics? Are there actual practices of birding that can, the goat example actually, right, that can help us push forward beyond that?
I feel like Juanita should answer this question, but I think that's a really powerful story and example, and in a strange way. I mean, I think that because my research area is so different from the U.S.-Mexico border, there's no crossing, there's no human crossing, right? So those, I mean, there are, but not. Well, anyway, there are some. I should revise, but not through the DMZ. So I think that the kinds of, maybe, we could say like the intersection of paths doesn't really happen where I'm working, but at the same time, I think that I don't want to give the impression that, privileging one kind of movement over another is the way to go. I think that they have to be considered in the same frame as you're suggesting. I think that, but what we often see is precisely what you're describing, is a kind of, ecologists, whomever, who sort of, embrace the apolitics of what they do, or the non-political nature of what they do. And this, I see this all the time with the DMZ and inter-Korean politics. Are people saying, oh, we can use, the phrase is always the peaceful utilization of the DMZ, meaning because pure nature exists there, we can start using it as the premise for talking about human peace. But again, it presumes that the nature that exists there is kind of outside of politics, even though it's obviously at the center of it, right? So and this goes back to the language and metaphor thing, where, the naturalization logics that are invited especially when it comes to biodiversity, really encourage a kind of divestment of any kind of political narrative or real, questions about power and inequality. So that's a long-winded way of saying it doesn't quite relate to what I do. It definitely relates to what Juanita does, and I'd love to hear her thoughts on it. But I think that the encouragement to think about those things as being always in the same frame is really important.
Pitch a couple more questions, and then we can open it up to the audience, I guess. Just briefly for Fabio, I thought the encouragement to think about porosity as a way to avoid the binary of invasive and sort of self-contained body, I think is quite provocative, and to think also of that porosity at very sort of invisible levels almost. We don't see a lot of how porous we are, right? I wonder how well that scales up. But I think my question is that even if we acknowledge the porosity of the human body and perhaps of community, metaphorically speaking, I wonder to what extent that really solves or opens onto more hospitable or sort of cosmopolitan outcomes, as I think you sort of gestured to it. In that, I think porosity can work in a number of different positive and negative valences, and perhaps not different that way from more sovereign account of bodies or of communities. They still sort of have the question of what are the negative, if one is porous and made by many different sorts of things, some of those things may be more or less desirable, right?
Yes.
And the parasites have that, I'm sorry, I assume I'm loud enough to be heard, mumbling.
I can hear you.
You can. Whether so the parasites as having a negative, right? They can sort of negative effects in ecological terms sometimes, right? Neutral ones or indeed positive ones, and I just wonder if those different valences change when we move from the sort of strict body to the porous body.
And I think what you were mentioning before, the necessity for the social sciences and discourse analysis to look at the natural sciences and biology, in the case of food, is front and center. Again, if you eat something that doesn't sit well with you, you can be sick or you can die. So there's always a risk there. It all becomes a matter of risk management, in a way. I didn't have time to go into it, but many of the SPS regulations of the WTO are built around the concept of risk and how, in fact, risk talks both to the biological sciences, but also to cultural and social context, because certain elements can be perceived as dangerous in a culture or another. So this porosity happens at all levels. I don't think that it gives us solutions, but it gives us way to think in a way that takes all these elements into consideration. And the fact that all it's mediated through the body, I think it's very important. here we're talking about embodied experiences. Before you mentioned affect, fears. In a way, our body, we don't want to get sick, right? So how do we construct this negotiation between the reality of the fear of dying and the reality that we're, always and already, as they say, porous and colonized and invaded? I don't think we can get out of that. I think that in a way defines us. And here there is another metaphor that has been proposed by my former political science professor in Italy, Roberto Esposito. He wrote a book called Communitas. What is that? Com munus. Munus, it's the gift, in a way that you give for free and that you share. And so in a way, it's at the core of commensality, which is also, sharing the table. Somehow we're consuming and eating together. And interestingly, he wrote Communitas, and then he wrote Immunitas, where he actually went into looking at how the same discourse becomes the basis for exclusion, for fear. But I like the idea of porosity precisely because it doesn't solve, but it puts us in front of a deep reality of who we are, and I think how the world somehow works.
I think we'll open up for questions. How does this work? We have a microphone going around. Great. Yes.
Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed this over the past 2 days. It's been excellent. And especially, Hugh, that article in Times, in fact, I've been thinking with for a very long time. And it's been something, whether you continue to like it or not.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. And this is kind of talking about naturalization of metaphor and the kind of feedback between the social, the political, and maybe the sciences language we've been talking about. So I wrote this down just so we can be brief about it. But over the last 2 days, we've been considering the compelling idea that we need to rid ourselves of the notion that a people belong to a place, or conversely, that a place belongs to a people. To rid ourselves of the notion that that an idea belongs to a place, or that a stable or pure ecology is a fantasy. We're colonies. We're colonized by germs, and we could not, in fact, survive without microbial overlords, referring to gut flora and decision making. That's recent data. So, working here with invasion not merely as a metaphor for its transferable meaning for moving in. This line of thinking is, to some, a striking refiguration of a familiar logic. It sustains a logic of their dispossession of their land, their ideas or traditions, and in fact, their bodies. So one of the things, in fact, with your article, having talked to some of the people I work with about it, the kind of compelling and sense-making that I get from where I'm inspired by it. But the difficulty in having this conversation and as well with you, Fabio. So I guess maybe if you could just maybe respond to what I said.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose. Well, and this also picks up on what Rafi was saying about this opposition between discourse and materiality. And I suppose one of the things we're talking about here really is the materiality of discourse and its concrete material, not just its concrete material effects, its actual material existence as well. But I think you're right that that this work on microbiomes has been, it's potentially a radical reconfiguration, not only of the way we think about bodies, but the way we think about relations with well, it can be a reconfiguration of the way that you think about a human body and the integrity of the body, and as you say, its porosity. I mean, that's an obvious place to go with it. Whether or not that's actually somewhere that it will lead in terms of a significant sort of significant reconfiguration that way. It's hard to say, of course, because the sense of bodily integrity is so strong, despite all the ways in which it's undermined. But it also opens up the possibilities for thinking about, I guess, is thinking about the absence of purities, which is something I was thinking about here in important ways. So, yeah, I mean, this becomes a start. If this is where you were going, it becomes a recently new starting point to start having these kinds of conversations, which of course is very interesting. Especially I think when these things are grounded, they're actually grounded in science, and you can take a non-deconstructionist view of science and actually start to talk about science as a kind of as a set of facts and realities. It's a sort of very interesting way to work from, I think, partly just because the constant deconstruction and sort of discursive making of everything becomes sort of exhausting after a point, and it's kind of nice sometimes to have this point of a sort of solid point of working from, even if it's a rhetorical gesture, you know. So there's something about the way this stuff has circulated popularly and started to get some kind of grounding that I think is very interesting and potentially important. Now, you know, you could say that this is it's a moment, right? It's a moment as a moment of movement from one paradigm to another, and so at this point opens up a new set of possibilities. So in that sense, I don't know if I'm getting towards your comment, but in that way, I think, yeah, I would entirely agree with you. It's very interesting. So it's a movement away from where I was writing about 5 years ago, because that stuff wasn't in my mind at all. But it would contribute to the general direction of that argument. But again, I think it's the only other thing I'd say is that I think it's partly a question of affinities. You know, presumably many of us here feel an affinity with that style of arguing and that style of thinking, and so would take this kind of science in that sort of direction, and we'd use it as that sort of opening. Now, how that works in terms of a form of argument for people who don't feel the appeal of that kind of reasoning and that form of logical and argumentative structure is really, really hard to say, I think. So in a way, partly I think what the issue is the forms of argument and the forms of I don't know what the term would be, like engagement or something, that might be possible in this moment. So you can see I'm sort of overwhelmed these days by what's happening to public discourse, and so I'm not so in some ways it's the issue to me isn't so much that these alternatives and opportunities exist. It's sort of like what happens with them and what you do with them. So in some ways then an appeal to the real of science is quite attractive, because that's a point of, it might be a point of commonality and agreement. Anyway, it's just some ideas.
Okay, this is on. So thank you all so much. It was really generative in thinking about stuff. So Rafi, when you were talking about going to the Hidalgo Pump House, which I've been to lots of times, and what came to my mind was a song by a conjunto group where they sing about los birds pa'l south y nosotros pa'l norte, right? So the birds are going south and we're going north, coming from communities of migrant workers whose communities revolve around that circularity, which in many ways doesn't exist that much as it once did. And then I thought, well, conjunto comes from the mixture of German polka and indigenous drumming and Spanish guitars, right? So my question is whether or not we can look to communities of the South for alternative framings, because for many of these communities that have this circulatory migration in their sort of model way of being, right? What's the language? And not that it's some kind of pure language, right? But what are the ways of thinking, and how can we bring those into discourse to think about alternative ways of conceptualizing this kind of thing, right? That moves away from this idea of purity and invasion. It's one thing that working on the border that's really struck me is just the extent to which these national borders are just so meaningless. Not, I mean, they're meaningful in the sense that they like stop people, but they're meaningless in in an ideological sense. In that, I mean, of course we should go north. Like that's how it goes, right? That's how it is. And so I also was thinking about the fact that the folks that you saw hiding in the bushes probably like work in Brownsville or something, right? Like people, not Brownsville, but maybe in that case, McAllen or something. Like people in that area cross all the time and they get caught all the time, but they keep crossing all the time because that's where their families live. That's where their girlfriend is. That's where the boyfriend, right? Okay, so my question is about communities of the South, but within that, I was thinking about your comment, your framing of becoming GOAT. So if we think about communities of the South, can we think about non-humans, as, you know, put into that category of the South, and also think about other ways of being with beings as you were? What are some of the concepts that can come with that sitting or with that standing or with that moving, right? That offer a different language. I don't know if that's a clear question.
It was very clear to me because I've done. I mean, you know, thinking about. In a way, I guess I've been trying to think about how to write about these relations between the people I study and the non-human life that they study, and to get back to the question about bodies and affect. I mean, that was part of the point of the paper, is that, you know, it's like their relationship to these birds is of course mediated, but in this case, like entirely embodied as well. And so for me, it was like a sort of, it was almost like a ritual. Like I entered into this space and I came out transformed, you know. And I think that, you know, it's not to say that they in any way have some like real like sense of the bird's interiority, but, you know, that this is a kind of movement towards understanding at least these ecologies, and you know, trying to kind of incorporate the ways in which media, technology are just so impossibly intertwined with all of these ways of knowing. I don't remember your question right now, but that's kind of where, you know, how I'm approaching the ethnography and the knowledge production. And, you know, I mean, and there's been so much written, you know, by anthropologists who study Amazonia and other indigenous groups in terms of very alternative ways of understanding, you know, the nature culture divide that, you know, still sort of orients most of our thinking. So you know, I've learned tons from that work. So.
Okay. I hope people can hear me. Thank you guys for your papers. They were really great, and I was hoping to maybe solicit some of your thoughts about invasiveness and temporality, because it seems like throughout the last 2 days, both time and space have come up in conversation. This is also prompted by the cartoon with like the genetically modified salmon, but also thinking in other contexts, including the Anthropocene and sort of counterterrorism and migration and things like that. But it seems like time has come up only kind of sporadically in these conversations, but it also seems to me that sort of invasiveness in an ecological register too, at least in terms of how it's talked about often in the US, like is very much a temporal construct as well. When we're thinking about harm, it's not so much the fact of a spatial breach in a moment, but it's rather this sort of the harm that is presumed to unfurl, you know, as ecologies become destabilized. So I was just wondering, you know, whether or not there's something also in the sort of anticipatory logics of that also underpin thinking about invasiveness that might be critically examined or denaturalized.
I don't know, just the first reaction to your question is the idea of immunization. right? That works over time. So, what if something that now is perceived as invasive over time becomes, in a way, part of who we are through a process of immunization, which is not immediately maybe refusal, but the ecosystem changes over time. But I think what's interesting in these issues when we project, the metaphors and the slippages onto politics, temporality is not the most important category. In the example I gave, about the couscous and the polenta, they didn't care about the reality of temporality. What was important was the urgency of feeling invaded by unknown people. And the desire that, the society doesn't get used to this. And we keep on feeling these people, these foods as external. So, temporality, it's very important when you go, from the politics to the biological. But at the same time, it's used in very creative way and brought back into the political to serve different goals and aims that maybe have nothing to do with the actual development of things as they happened. I don't know. This is just a gut reaction to your question.
Can I respond to that one? I guess one way to take that is to think about, the conceit of the Anthropocene is that we live in apocalyptic times, and that invasives are part of that. And they're often thought of in these. Talking about biological invasive species, they're often thought of in these apocalyptic terms. So there's, the standard examples of zebra mussels and kuzu and things like that. These highly destructive forms. So there is definitely a question about temporality, but it's this sense of this approaching disaster, and so that it's anticipatory in that sense, I think. And then the only response is some kind of remediation or hope or this kind of thing. And it's sort of ironic, and not ironic's not really the word, but there's a weird sort of disjunction, because at the same time, the idea of the Anthropocene is that it's a geologic time period, and geologic time works on these massive, like superhuman scales. So there's a weird disjunction. There's this weird disjuncture going on between the immediacy of disaster, if you like, and it's like rapid, uncontrollable approach, and the sense that these things have been unfolding, would sort of like naturally unfold on an entirely different time scale. That we're also participating in some way. So I think you're right to raise that question, and invasives are actually part of that narrative, if you like.
This sounds very simple, but I think we need to remember that there are limits to language, and I think it's the search for a kind of language to transgress this might actually hinder the creative process of finding possibilities. I just wanted to remind us of the limits of language. There's a... I'll get back to that. I've currently run out. But there's 3 little moments I wanted to bring up. Fabio, you mentioned something about the fear of food. I've been thinking about this fear and the fear of the other and fear. And I'm wondering if there's... if we can flip that to a kind of appreciation. I'm thinking about the way flu shots work. Mm-hmm. I'm no scientist here, but infecting the body with the flu to help to get rid of the flu, mm-hmm. right? Or C. diff is a kind of condition of the intestinal tract or something, and I know that there are studies that are in Australia, I think it is, where they're actually using fecal implants to combat this. And here's this, fecal matter, and we think of it as this, maybe we even fear it, right? And this, some other disability theorists wrote a book called The Politics of Shit. Just on that note. And then also some strands of HIV, I believe, are being used to combat other strands of cancer. And, I don't know if there's a word for this kind of model, but for us to look at the value of this scary, invasive other and utilize something there. I don't know if that could relate to your disciplines, or if we have a name for that kind of model.
I don't know about the name, but it's what I was mentioning before, this sort of ambivalence between neophilia and neophobia. We cannot get out of that. We are afraid, but at the same time, we need something different. It becomes desire, in a way. Desire and need at that point become sort of complicated. And, the first reaction where you pass from the neophobia to the neophilia, it's going through this phase of disgust, in a way, And the example of the microbiome is very interesting from that point of view. And it happens a lot with food. When there are new foods introduced to us, sometimes, we have this reaction of, no, this is not good for me. And then you taste it and you're like, okay, maybe I can add this to my... And so through this management and negotiation with disgust, you go from the fear to somehow the inclusion and even to the desire. I mean, recently I've been having exchanges with the Nordic Food Lab that works with Noma in Copenhagen. And I was there and they had me taste insects for the first time. That was an interesting experience for me. And I was not completely new to the idea. I grew up in a region of Italy where we have cheese with, tiny maggots, and it's part of the cheese, and it's delicious. But moving from that, which was sort of the habitual disgust in a way, to this new form, it took me, it took a little while. And I think, this metaphorically can be extended also to other aspects. I mean, the idea of the immunization in a way is the same, the fear, the disgust, and then, you ask that for yourself when you go and get your shot. I don't know, maybe that's a way to think about it.
Yes, I have two questions, one for Hugh and one for Professor Kim. I really love the way all the panels have opened up the questions of mobility, migration, and sort of interspecies politics. But for Hugh, my question is around the moment where you said you were moved by the ceremony. After all, it's called a naturalization ceremony. I hadn't quite thought of that in relation to this conference. But I was not expecting you to say that you were moved. So I was wondering if you could just reflect on exactly sort of why that was the case and how that might link even just to the notion of the cemetery ceremony issue. But I think there is something going on in the affective piece there that I'd just like to see if you have any thoughts on. And then for Professor Kim, my question is, or the bit that I would have loved more, as soon as you had mentioned it, was the soundscape. So I have this deep longing now to have heard the soundtrack. And I think that's connected for me to Rafi's question about how to open up the kind of domains of sort of discursive communication. And I wonder if you could talk more about soundscapes and soundtracks and if we could hear it at some point.
Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, you know, Vicky, that was it was surprising to me too. I went in, with the predictable cynicism to the whole thing, just like, really, really happy to get it over and done with. And, also I'd gone through this whole thing, like I'm sure many people do, of, do I want to do this or don't I want to do this? Oh, well, what the hell, I might as well do it anyway because I can keep my other passport, And, but it was a very, it was a sort of humbling experience actually for me, partly because, partly because it was such a wide range of people in there, and people talked a little, so you got a sense of what people's why people were doing it, and there was a kind of, I know this, I feel weird even saying this, but there was sort of a moment when there was this sort of shift to sincerity, I suppose. Like everybody had been, not everybody, but many people had been sort of like messing around or just like rolling their eyes at all the stuff for quite a while during the process. Because, to get there, and I mean, it's a lot easier for me than for many people, but to actually get to that point, the crap that you have to go through, I mean, I don't know if other people, I'm sure plenty of other people here have been in this situation, but, just going down to Federal Plaza over and over and over again. I mean, it took me like, I don't know, like 11 years, I think, because it got caught up in 9/11 in the middle of it. So my whole file just sort of disappeared for about 3 years, whilst they turned their attention to other things. So there was this, so I'd gone through this whole thing of going down there and just watching. It didn't particularly happen to me. I mean, I had a lot of inconvenience. Like, you'd get to, do people really want to hear this? I mean, it doesn't seem like, I guess we have time, right? But, of getting down there and standing in line for getting down at like 7 o'clock in the morning downtown and standing in line, finally getting to the window. And as you get to the window, they put up a sign saying closed for the day, even though it's only like 9:15 or something. Like we've reached our quota for the day, this kind of thing, like over and over again, seeing people whose first language wasn't English, just getting shouted at because, when they were talked louder to, then they'd have more chance of understanding, this kind of thing. I mean, just abusive. And actually under Obama, things have got better because there was this whole thing of sort of like civilizing the process to some extent. But I've actually, because I've passed that stage now, I have no idea what it's actually like. But it was a really abusive, difficult thing that at each point people, because you'd then have to leave the buildings and you'd be in the elevator and everybody would just be like venting about what they'd just gone through. And so everybody's caught in this position of just not wanting to participate in this thing any longer, but sort of having to, because you're committed to this pass, because for whatever personal reasons you're committed to trying to get some sort of like regularization of your status in this country. So you have no option, and of course the people on the other side of it know you have no option, so they're, just taking full advantage of that, because it's that kind of abusive structure that you're caught up in. Sorry, I can whine about this for a very long time. So the ceremony was sort of the culmination of that, but it was also this point where sort of a kind of relief, I suppose, but also there was this recognition on the other side, on the side of the people who were supervising the ceremony, that moment was past. It was like you'd sort of gone through that, and you are now sort of being accepted into this community, which is a very weird ambivalent thing, given what, apart from anything, given your ambivalence about that community anyway, but also what you've been through to get there. So it was a very surprising thing. I think my reaction was a sort of, I thought it would actually be a temporary one as well. And I was sort of like embarrassed at feeling this sort of like wave of sincerity, because we're all taught to be so, like cynical about all this, and I've learned to sort of like inhabit that, this persona of cynicism, I suppose, around these kinds of questions. But then writing this piece actually made me revisit that and think that what sounded like platitudes at the time, or what sort of quite quickly afterwards started to feel like platitudes, actually at some level were very meaningful, because it's a very powerful strain of American thought that actually, having grown up having grown up in Britain and always felt at some level like you didn't belong because you'd always be reminded that you didn't belong. But then coming to New York and feeling actually very, very differently about it. And I appreciate all the reasons why I'm able to feel like that and other people aren't. But I feel like it's a very strong and important tradition in American political life that actually should be protected despite its limitations and all its problems and all those other critiques that we can mount of it. So that was sort of a moment when it became very visible and just I guess effective in ways that I hadn't really thought about before. So I think that was a very, very long answer to the question, but anyway, that's more or less it. Yeah.
So I'll be very quick. As far as soundscapes, yes, it was. I'm sorry I didn't have the clip to share with you all. You may have not liked me so much after you had heard it. It was very deafening. But just in terms of, you know, how I think about it, I mean, it was really kind of like reaching the sensory limits of one's body. And the ornithologist who I traveled with, he had once spent the night on that island, and he said they never stop. So it's just, you know, you feel completely as if you're inside this, you know, this really inhospitable place for you know, for non-avians, and for some of the birds as well, pretty inhospitable. But I was also interested in how, you know, for the, you know, and some of you may be familiar with efforts on the part of the International Crane Foundation to save endangered cranes in the U.S., where they put on like crane outfits and, you know, act as the sort of parents in loco parentis for baby cranes. And they've just decided to discontinue that project because the cranes who've been raised by the humans in crane clothing aren't able to raise their own chicks. They end up dying because they actually weren't parented. So anyway, this is not to sort of return to some pure notion of nature, but just I think it's interesting to think about sort of biosemiotics and how different kinds of communication are sort of invented by the people who are studying, in this case, birds. So, you know, taking on the goat's clothing was one sort of biosemiotic example, and I think, you know, and one that didn't happen was there were no bird calls. They weren't trying to use, you know, vocalizations to reach out to the birds. And the last thing I'll say is the DMZ research that I've done, in fact, is marked by a lot of silence. And so most people who go there will just remark upon how different it is from an urban soundscape, and that becomes part of the sort of another layer of naturalizing that environment as being, you know, much more exotic and foreign for visitors. So.
I think we'll take one round of questions, and if there are any, and you can respond to whichever you like, and we can end.
This is a more general question, so it can go also to other participants or speakers. Yesterday I was thinking about this term entanglement, and we are so interconnected, and yet I was somehow, you know, not feeling the connection because we are talking about the invasive other. The invasive other, sorry. Have you heard the previous? Okay. We're talking about the invasive other, but we are not talking so much about the defensive self. Like, there is so much defensiveness and, you know, the constant feeling under threat and perpetually not trusting that. And I think maybe David brought this up in his presentation. So I refuse to feel pessimistic about this apocalyptic, you know, world. I would like some hope about how we can collectively survive, even including the non-humans. So I wanted just to ask about some thoughts on the...
You don't have to worry about non-humans.
No, I mean how we, how the humans collaboratively can survive. Not. Yeah. All right?
I sort of expressed my point of view in the previous answer. That it is the way we are, and you know, we eat together. In a way, we are what we eat with. For me, that's a little bit the answer to that very, very quickly.
Do you have concluding remarks?
You know, I kind of want to respond to you, which is that, I mean, yeah, of course, I mean, there's always hope and possibility, and you can find it. It partly depends on how you look at things, right? You can find these things anywhere. I mean, perhaps there isn't anywhere the hope for, you know, large-scale utopian projects anymore, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, I think. But you can always read possibility out of a political situation. I mean, personally, I think the whole notion of the Anthropocene is baloney. But, you know, so I think it would be very helpful to set that aside, because it is an overwhelmingly apocalyptic vision. I don't think it's helpful conceptually or in any way at all. And it also, well, anyway, we don't have to do that. But you know, I don't worry about there not being hope in that sense, and don't worry about there not being non-humans in the broad sense are going to outlive humans without any difficulty at all. If you want to think about individual species, maybe it's another question. But there's certainly you don't have to be pessimistic necessarily, because being pessimistic isn't actually going to help you resolve anything anyway.
Any final thoughts? I think we'll stop there. Thank you all to the panelists and for the audience. Thank you.